Perfect. We're just kind of we obviously we rescheduled this last minute and holiday week and whatnot. So, and you can hear me okay when I
Loud and
speak
clear.
loudly rather than when I'm. Sorry about that. All right, so we are live and I can hear myself, which is not good. Fix that. All right. Okay. And just to make sure, it's Steve Hardy, co-founder of Big Calm Tiny Homesteads.
That's it.
Perfect. Sometimes, I start into that spiel and I realize I haven't confirmed co-founder or title status, and if I don't, sometimes I get in trouble later. So, all right. So we're recording. We're doing well. All right. Welcome back to Startup Talk. I'm your host, the Startup Coach, founder of Toronto Starts, one of the largest startup communities in Canada. And with me today is Steve Hardy, co-founder of Big Calm Tiny Homesteads. Welcome, Steve.
Nice to be here, Craig. Thank you.
Well, we were talking a little bit offline beforehand, but why don't you start by telling us about Big Calm Tiny Homesteads?
Yeah, Big Calm is a permaculture guided tiny homesteads community here in British Columbia in the Kootenays. So not in Toronto, some distance away, but a nice spot to either visit or live and work from. And that's the main goal of Big Calm, is to have a small community in nature that also has the connections so that you could work or collaborate remotely with others.
I've seen a lot of the pictures from your website, and then I did some research. And Kootenay, there used to be some beer commercials around there where you got to see all the different rivers and mountains. It looks beautiful. Now, is it really that beautiful?
It's really that beautiful. Yeah, we're in an inland temperate rainforest. That's not a fake background. That's the real. There's a cedar glen right through the window there. Um, it's it's not super rainy. I mean, it rains a fair bit, but it's not super rainy like the coast. The mountains aren't kind of cold and imposing like in the Rockies. It's kind of in between, and nice moderate climate most of the year.
So I like to get to the heart of who the entrepreneur really is. So why don't we start with what were you like growing up? Were you a handful for your parents? Were you studious, into music, sports, socializing?
Yeah, I was. I'd say I was a good kid. My parents were great and let us try a lot of different things. So I was a good student. I was active in sports, soccer, played basketball through college. Um, uh, my late grandmother had a farm, so every weekend as a young kid we'd go out there and just kind of explore the open space, which was just a joy for a young boy, and was also involved in music. So I was kind of nerdy things like being part of a marching band at one point. Yeah, so it was a really good childhood, I'd say. Was able to try a lot of different things and learn a lot of different things.
And what was your early career path like? Or maybe you're still in it. I'm an old guy, and I think everybody has a. Did you start off university jobs?
Yeah, I was well, through college and university. I was working in bulk foods at a grocery store for a number of years. That was my part-time work. So early mornings and weekends doing that. And then during university, they don't have these anymore, but I was a parking booth attendant, which was a very small confined space for 4 or 5 hour shifts, with surge periods where I'd have to do the work and the rest of the time I could study. So I got paid to study. And then had some wonderful internships, including one at an idea agency in Toronto, and and then eventually fell into a career in marketing, which has kind of meandered into product and content management and consumer electronics and startups.
So here you are working in Toronto, or working all different places, working for companies in Toronto or other big city places. At what point did you say, I don't physically want to live here. I want to live somewhere else.
It was, I think I've always kind of felt it's either city or country, maybe not suburbs for me. And yeah, like I went to school in Calgary, worked there for a little bit. I worked in a marketing communications agency, then really wanted to explore the big city, and landed in Montreal for 13 years and enjoyed working in magazine publishing, the kind of the first wave of mobile content production. Got involved with a tech toy maker called Huawei. They do toy robotics and consumer electronics. So I work mostly on their virtual world scoping and consumer electronics line. As I mistakenly told my mother, adult toys at one point. And then also got involved with a project that became a startup that I became president of, and that was based in Calgary. So that was in disaster management and resilience. And throughout that time, I spent a lot of time in the larger cities, either pitching or selling or partnership kind of brokering. In Canada and the States, a fair bit of travel, and loved the cities. Really liked working there. I had no complaints. Loved the culture, the dining, the entertainment, all of that. It wasn't until I moved back west, where I was kind of looking for that same vibe, but maybe in a little bit quieter setting. And that eventually drew me out to a small town called Nelson in interior BC. It's about 10, 11,000 people. But it has a big city vibe in a way. It's got a great dining scene, band stop there, really nice kind of festival environment and street culture. A lot of the same things that you'd find in Toronto and Montreal. And then of course the surrounding area, mountain biking and skiing and hiking and just sightseeing was amazing in this part. So that's eventually what kind of planted the seed, and then my wife and I would eventually start coming out looking for places to potentially live, and we found this place.
It seems like a big leap from building VR worlds for companies and jumping to living in a tiny home in the middle of a forest. And
if you put it that way.
And making this an entrepreneurial experience. So, you're looking for places to live. At what point do you say, let's turn this into a business?
Yeah, it was, well, I think part of it was that I was both my wife Abby and I were just spending a lot of time in front of the screen, and just as you do as an entrepreneur, or certainly over the pandemic period, you're spending a lot of time on Zoom calls and at the screen working on digital products and so on. And I think wanting a little bit of a counterbalance there, being closer to nature, getting outdoors, fresh air, that sort of thing. So that was one of the draws to this. The kind of the genesis of the Big Calm project was finding this particular property. This is in 2019, before the pandemic. Absolutely beautiful, but it had this old original homesteader cabin on it. 1969, beautiful log building, but unfortunately on bare earth, and the foundation was giving out. So it was not immediately habitable, and would be quite expensive to build out. So what got us going down this path was that we had this side interest in interesting modular or design, like housing design structures, earthships, rammed earth, tiny houses. All of those are kind of in the same conversation. And then also seeing this old cabin and needing to find perhaps commercial insurance possibilities. It wouldn't fit residential. So we started going down the path of, well, what could we do commercially that would make this property accessible? And then tying that with our curiosities around housing structures, in particular tiny houses, and seeing how so many people want to have, like, there's a huge trend around tiny houses, but the zoning is very restrictive in many places, especially out east. And often people are limited to kind of laneways or parking lot campgrounds that don't balance the kind of the beautiful builds that are possible now. So that's what led us down the path of building a community for tiny houses on wheels that had the benefits of being kind of premium and community, but also spacious and tied to nature.
So what exactly does Big Calm do?
Uh, Big Calm is so we're still in the build phase, but it's essentially kind of three in my budget. It's kind of three main items. The first is the core community, which is for long-term rentals. So in that sense, it's kind of it's a mobile home park specifically for tiny houses on wheels, um, and but then it also has a short-term rental side of things. So an Airbnb like the one I'm sitting in right now, where guests can come on their vacations or their workations and just kind of focus or relax. And then thirdly would be other possibilities down the road, like hosting events like weddings or workshops around solar energy or permaculture design, different aspects like that are kind of more knowledge sharing. So those are kind of the three main things that we do.
Well, that leads naturally into my next question, which is what is permaculture?
Yeah. So it's not a word that's widely known. And for those who have heard of it, they tend to associate it with gardening, which it does have an aspect of gardening to it, but it's actually much bigger and broader. It's basically a set of design principles around whole systems thinking that is generally inspired by nature. So looking at the whole systems of nature, how things grow, where they grow, how the creatures interact with certain spots, how humans interact with those plants and animals, and what sort of systems can collect and retain and use the energy and grow things, food or otherwise. It's in that sense, it's really very closely aligned with like design thinking as you'd apply it to technology projects, where you're trying to look at systems and see how they can optimally interact. And really kind of the core tenet of permaculture is to observe and then interact. And so you're taking a look at what are the patterns and how can those be kind of collated into particular paths that make sense, particular spots for development or not. And so in that sense, permaculture I see in the same lens maybe as resilience was several years ago, where it was kind of an obscure word. People generally understood it, but didn't really interact with it. And now resilience is very much front and center in the news and in how we live and work. I think permaculture and that whole systems approach tied to nature is similar.
So, like you said, most people have heard of tiny homes before. It's pretty popular now in culture, but can you explain your version of community, pocket neighborhoods?
Pocket neighborhoods is it's a concept that was put forward by a gentleman by the name of Ross Chapin. He's published a book about pocket neighborhoods, which aren't exclusively rural at all. Pocket neighborhoods exist actually quite successfully in large cities as well. It's something that urban thinkers like Jane Jacobs have really put forward there as like, how can you be in a large city or in a rural setting or in a suburban setting and still have the benefits of a community? How can you have, I think he called it watchfulness, where you've got these private or semi-private clusters of houses that are intentionally arranged so that kids can play safely because the neighbors are watching. If there's any sort of threat or disturbance in the neighborhood, there's people that are taking care and are mindful of the community. And a lot of that ties to the types of dwellings, how they're placed, the space around them, and also the interaction with outdoors, which has that nice crossover with permaculture. Is that it's different than an apartment or condo building, and it's also quite different than a suburban space, where it tends to be a little bit more like European kind of settings, and you see them in places like Toronto and Montreal, all over, just these small little places that tend to be kind of like inward facing or circular or enclaves that people know who they are and what they're doing and the kids, and they've got that nice sort of mini community within it. And so that's an inspiration for us here, as we have a really nice bench to build on, that's got this kind of horseshoe shape already, and trying to figure out what is the optimal number of places and how are they oriented, and then also that because we are in a more isolated rural location, that there is still a community feel here where we're looking out for each other, and both socially as well as kind of existentially as well, like just as safety.
When I
Oh,
grew up, I knew all my neighbors, like all down all the streets. I knew who they were, whether they had kids or not. I knew everybody. We really had a sense of community. Even the local school where I went to, we'd have a hockey rink outside that everybody go to after school, and we'd all take care of. Where did that sense of community go? We're bigger populations, we're more of us living together. You would figure we would have more of that community, but it seems like it's disappearing.
yeah, I think it's the paradox that kind of the larger you go, the harder it is to maintain that. The community, it's like when you're talking about organizations, right? That the dynamic within a team of, say, up to 12 is quite different. And then as that say startup grows to be 30, that's a different dynamic. You've still got the founders involved, but you've got a larger team. You're generally in the same office space and crossing paths. And then of course you get larger than that, perhaps up to 150, I think is the magic number, where then you become a little bit more hierarchical and bureaucratic, and it's a very different sort of process needed to run that. And the same happens with neighborhoods and um, cities, is that the kind of the small town feel changes as you grow, or the neighborhood changes. If you are, for example, if everybody has a very large suburban house where that's their cocoon and it's just the family, then you're kind of turning your back on the neighborhood outside, and you're not, because you have your own big backyard, you don't need to go to the park and cross paths with a neighbor, and you don't necessarily need to, maybe you don't have your balcony that's facing the street, and so you don't see the kids playing on the road on their bikes. You don't see sort of the comings and goings of people from the neighborhood convenience store, that sort of thing. So I think we've kind of designed out some of the serendipity that makes those neighborhoods neighborly, and there are successful attempts or not successful attempts to try to bring that back. But in some ways, I think we've kind of outgrown it, or our development methods have outgrown it.
Yeah, 150 is the Dunbar number. So anybody
Yes.
wants to look it up, the magic Dunbar number, you can look that up and dive down that rabbit hole sometime. So how do you keep your sense of community and be apart, isolated without isolation?
That's one of the biggest draws to Big Calm by the folks that are applying to live here, is that um, they it's also tying very closely to tiny houses, because in a tiny house you don't have a whole lot of space. You can't just go to another wing of the house or to the basement. So outdoors and kind of community amenity space becomes a lot more important. Then it becomes like another room. It's your living room in a sense, or if you have an amenity building that could be a forest office or a relaxation space, then those become kind of extended rooms to your tiny house. So then the tiny doesn't actually apply as much, that you've actually got plenty of space. You're not just in this smaller box. But one of the draws to coming to a place like Big Calm is that these are people, including Abby and I, we're not interested in just coming out here and being in the middle of the woods by ourselves. That there is an interest in having other like-minded folks with different skills, different perspectives that would be around us. And that's of appeal to those that are applying as well, is that they they want their own space. They want to be closer to nature, but they also want to be around people. They're not antisocial. Maybe they might tilt towards being introverted, but they are, high functioning introverts or ambiverts. They do want that community space. They do want social activities. They do want to take part in maybe DIY fix up jobs or gardening that is a lot more fun when you've got other people doing it with you.
Now, what does the business model look like?
Yeah. So as mentioned earlier, it's long-term rental, short-term rental, and then kind of that other category of events or workshops or perhaps an online presence, but fairly widely used, widely known models around long-term rent. So in the same way as an apartment building, for example, or a rental suite, kind of month by month on a rental, kind of that's your monthly recurring revenue. And then on the short-term rental side would be kind of more of those peaks around particular seasons or weekends, and that's again a very familiar model that people have been using with Airbnb or with guest stays or hotels or experiential retreats.
Yeah, retreat sounds like it'll be an interesting business area for you.
I'm really interested to see where the next phase of remote work goes. So as teams have become perhaps more remote first or remote only, but still recognizing that they do need to sync up every once in a while, whether socially or to do kind of deep work, focus work together. For us in particular, it would be smaller teams that do want to detach for a week or perhaps send their coders to just focus for 2 weeks, to kind of carve out the noise around them and just to focus and also, get in some relaxed time there. So I'm interested to see how the workation or the working retreat space evolves over the next few years.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because I think a lot of companies who are giving up rent, remote workers and stuff, where you used to have like a corporate retreat once a year, maybe once every 2 years, depending on what's going on. Now that changes because you might do it 3 or 4 times a year with different groups, because we're all separated. And so now the model changes because you're bringing to bring that culture together, and you're not paying for rent all year round. So you're putting money in a different bucket.
Yeah, I think there's the kind of the Marriott crowd where and this might be just that your organization is so large or it's hard for people to travel. And so you'd go to the ballroom experience kind of as before the pandemic. And then right now you're seeing movement towards kind of working retreats that are in like Portugal, or where, yeah, it's kind of more that Orlando or Vegas sort of getaway, where you could also have fun when you're out there and get different experiences. And then I think my hunch is that there will be something that's more modest for smaller teams, or that is a different type of experience than just the touristy ones.
I agree. I think there's a whole different vibe for cultures around taking a mountain biking tour, going fishing, doing, the outside activities, sitting around a bonfire together. There's so many different things that grow culturally than being, say, at a Christmas party or in a boardroom.
Yeah, and you get to try and learn different things and do it as a team. So there's a learn by doing component to that, skill building, which that's a big perk for companies. It doesn't have to be specific to the job role. In fact, it could complement it quite nicely.
Yeah, we could all learn to throw axes out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
It just sounds like it's a great idea. I think also when you're out in nature and in this kind of environment, people are more transparent, more natural, more who they are. The errors disappear, the titles disappear when you're all sitting around a campfire versus, in a corporate ballroom all dressed up. Like, it just
100%.
changes the whole thing. So it's a great dynamic I think people are interested in. Now, putting on my startup coach hat, who's your target market and how do you get in front of them? Like, I'm thinking digital nomads who are getting back to nature, environmentalists. Are they young, old, couples, singles? Like, how do you target them?
I think there's some stereotypes there that don't actually play out actually. So when we were first kind of testing this concept a couple of years ago, we put up the website and it's this whole idea of a tiny homestead community is like, are we crazy? Are other people also interested in something like this? And over the last couple of years, we've been repeatedly surprised at the breadth of people or personality types that have been drawn to this. It's less the ones that I think you would most often associate, say, with tiny houses. So for us, it tends to be more kind of middle-aged. Demographically, it tends to be a little bit more middle-aged. So I think the stereotype is that it's young couples right out of college or something. And we have seen some of those folks, but generally it's middle-aged or a little older. We have kind of semi-retired seniors that are still, they wouldn't call themselves seniors. They're very active. A lot of independent women, perhaps recently divorced or just interested in living independently, but within community, that are generally, we're finding people that can work remotely. And that ranges, it's not just designers and developers, but it's a whole range of really interesting careers that can be done anywhere now. I think psychographically, there's a shared interest around permaculture and kind of the wellness that comes from being around nature. And it's not hardcore environmentalists. It's just people who are, they're aware of climate change and aware of the environment. They're aware of the balance that they find when they are walking through a forest or mountain biking or hiking. And especially when we connect that with tiny houses or different types of builds, there's a very strong appetite for environmentally friendly or eco-conscious building technologies. And those can be very simple and old-fashioned, or they could be very, very, very modern and kind of cutting edge and technological in the digital sense. And so we're seeing a lot of curiosity around solar, around compost toilets, around building materials, boring things like heat recovery from plumbing. So there's that common thread, I think, in terms of our kind of target market is folks that are looking for mental wellness, kind of that balance. They're aware of climate change and wanting to perhaps build up their manual skills or resilience, which is partly community based. And then also, the last couple of years of the pandemic has changed how they can work and live with the whole remote thing. So those would be the common target things, more so than the demographics, which have been more across the board.
Which makes it hard to target, which is just the whole point of view. As a startup, you're like, okay, where do I go to get in front of people interested in this lifestyle? Where do I find them? Do I advertise on Facebook or this magazine, this type of places? How are you getting the word out and getting traction and building your audience?
It hasn't been that hard to target because so whether it's permaculture, tiny houses, or to a lesser extent remote work, those are fairly vibrant niches. So there's communities that are very active, the word of mouth is very strong in those spaces, and in particular on Facebook, but in other groups, kind of side groups as well that are focused there. So I think like targeting the psychographics that those particular verticals each have hasn't been that much of a challenge. I think that was one of our earlier shifts, was to move from kind of demographic assumptions to more of around what are the hobbies and interests and working profiles of the folks.
Now, you started this or were looking at the property or maybe even bought the property back in 2019.
Yeah, we put an option to purchase in 2019, and then we tested the concept before we actually purchased. And then the pandemic happened, so that changed things too. And so we had this option. We exercised it that first spring in 2020. Purchased it mid-year.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to ask is exactly about that. You came into this with an idea in 2019 before COVID saying, hey, we have a community. This is a great idea. Let's build this situation. But maybe it would be hard to fill. Maybe it would be not as easy to find people to come out and be able to remote work. And then COVID hits. So the type of people who can remotely work, the amount of people who can remotely work changes all of a sudden. How does it affect your business plan and the model of what you're doing?
It slipped right in with the assumptions that we had pre-pandemic. It was, I mean, lemons from lemonade, lemonade from lemons. And it was it is a big accelerator. I think initially we assumed that people would see the concept as they'd be skeptical around it, and that was, I think, true to a large extent. And then as the pandemic gradually moved on, and you started to see, staycations, or you started to see the kind of the imposed remote work, or just the I got to get out and go for a walk a little bit more, like all of those things contributed to saying, hey, we're hitting the right spot. Like there's an intersection here that we had a hunch on, and it's starting to play out. And we were connecting those dots kind of in real time as it was moving a bit quicker.
So sounds like you're overbooked or you're booked up now.
We're, I'd say, midway through that process. So we have been doing a lot of customer discovery, or just meeting with people, but it is a big decision whether it's to move to BC or to move to rural. We're not that far from larger cities like Nelson or Castlegar, but it is a big life decision. Also, the whole is my job going back to the office soon? So there has been sort of people assessing, are they following that company, or is their company moving in that direction, or are they going to go in a different direction because they like remote work, or maybe they hate it and they don't want to, and that was just something that was a temporary thing for them. So the kind of the read on it's been evolving in that sense.
What is your funding situation?
Yeah, so we are currently live on Equivesto. Ryan and Alex, who I know you interviewed just recently, a great team, and so they do equity crowdfunding. We've been in touch with them for quite some time, and have put together an equity crowdfunding campaign, which is live now. There's about 2 months left on our particular raise, which we intentionally wanted to include retail or smaller non-accredited investors in our efforts to basically accelerate the build. And so our business plan was always fairly conservative and phased. We have had higher than expected interest, as you were alluding to. And also just getting contractors and trades on site in a phased approach would be, I think, a bit of a painful exercise for us. So we'd like to maybe do the next leg of it. So we've already done a fair bit of development. We've pulled the services out from power lines and built up the common building in the middle. So the Shangri-La loft, which is laundry and storage and eventually community space. So we've done a fair bit just bootstrapped on our own, but we do want to accelerate the build out of the community pads and the amenity buildings. And so that's where the Equivesto raise comes in, is to help us do that in one shot, so that we can take advantage of the demand that we're seeing, and also take advantage of having busy contractors on site doing that work all at once, rather than stretched out over multiple phases or years. The raise itself is for dividend generating preferred shares. And so over the long term, again, for generally smaller retail investors, starting at 2,500 that they would get quarterly dividends for 10 years that start at 6% and move up to 15% in the last year. So a bit of a hedge on inflation as well, which is another kind of evolving macro consideration. But for us, it lets people that see the trends around tiny houses and permaculture and remote work and mental wellness and so on, which tend to be maybe smaller investors, that it gives them a way to participate in the project, whether they live here or not, that they can be a part of the venture and see it kind of grow and be part of it over the long term.
And retail investors are just people like you and me who aren't accredited investors.
That's right. Yeah.
Just to make sure that people understand that concept.
Yeah, Equivesto has, and this is guided by the regulations within Canada and the different provinces, but there's basically retail investors, which is pretty much anybody to a limited amount can invest in private companies like ours. And Equivesto has a whole slate of really interesting startups and projects, some real estate, some tech. And then there's an eligible category. So if you've gone through a couple extra steps with your financial planner or your accountant, then you're able to invest a little bit more. And then, of course, if you're accredited, then the sky's the limit. You can invest as you would, in any startup. But Equivesto really makes it possible now for folks that aren't at that level to also get involved with companies like ours at an early stage.
And what's the minimum amount people can invest?
The minimum for our campaign is 2,500. I think the minimum generally with some campaigns on Equivesto can be 100, but because we're more of a dividend offering rather than common shares, it just made sense for it to be a little bit higher so that those dividends were significant. So the minimum is 2,500, and then the various levels I was mentioning, I think retail is 5,000, eligible is 10,000, and accredited is whatever.
So you're offering, with the market right now going skyrocket, roller coaster all over the place, all-time lows and then jumping back and then whatnot. People are looking for alternative investments, and you're giving an opportunity for people to buy preferred shares, dividend, and giving them a dividend. Again, what's the percentage on the dividend?
So there'll be 10 dividend producing years. So post build out, the funds will go towards accelerating the build out. And then in the first year of that is 6% paid each quarter. So 6% annually, but paid quarterly. And then that goes up a percentage point every year thereafter, up to 15%. And so as the project gets more mature and that you've kind of got this passive income throughout the journey there. And it includes a range of other perks as well. So we've partnered with a chocolatier just down the road and an Indigenous arts box project here in BC, as well as various perks on site here as well. So it's not just the equity, but kind of a full package there.
And for those people listening on the podcast, I'll make sure the links are in the show notes. You can just click on the chapter link or check the show notes. But where do people go if they're interested in investing?
Yeah, I'd say equivesto.com. So if you go up to browse offerings in their menu, you'll see us within, I think, about a dozen other companies that are currently raising, or just a shorter URL is bigcalm.ca/invest.
Now, have you found many challenges? You mentioned getting electricity and all that other stuff out there. How has that been, that whole process of just getting internet and water running and power out there?
Not a problem. So we already had we have a power line that comes to the site. So it was a dwelling for the previous owner. So they've built out. There's 2 water sources, and we'll be putting in a well. There was an existing septic system, and we've put in a large community one. That's kind of the beast of the project. And then there was also a power line coming here, so it is connected to the grid. We're looking at building in kind of redundant systems. So having, like I said, the community septic that's gravity fed, building out a solar array with battery storage, um, and, and other energy saving items in there as well. So the biggest challenge I think with the build has been more just around, it's the stuff everyone's dealing with around supply chain. And so you never know if you're going to have to wait months for that door or that special sand, or we had to wait 4 months for insulation on the Shangri loft. And and then also there were crews that would kind of like drywall or plumbing that would have to drop out halfway through because of COVID and then come back later. So it's been those setbacks that have been the most challenging. But the services are here, and we've been making them more robust. The internet that I'm on right now is Starlink, which is extremely fast and very reliable. And we're looking at making that redundant as well with a couple other ISPs. There's also a fiber optic backbone line that's not too far. It was just buried in the rails trails, just a couple of kilometers from here, that will eventually be another high-speed internet connection for us to connect into.
So what kind of outdoor activities is there to do where you are?
Well, in the winter, we're not immediately close to a ski hill. They're not too far. There's Whitewater and Nelson, and Big Red and Roslyn, and the smaller one up by Summit by the cusp. So there's ski hills for those that are into winter sports like that. Abby and I have really enjoyed getting into snowshoeing. The snow can pile up in the winter, and it's winter wonderland like, so you can kind of walk into the treetops. There's a great mountain biking scene, some good hiking. I'm not a climber, but I'm told that there's some good climbing not too far from here. We're near a river and a lake, so there's kind of paddle boarding or just tubing down the river in the summer. On site, just walking around is nice, and then working in the garden, or the fix-up projects that I'm working on. So there's a range of that.
And I grew up cross country skiing. I think my dad realized with 3 kids, it was much easier to take us cross country than, or
No
cheaper
hockey.
anyway, than, well, we did hockey as well, but then downhill skiing and buying passes for us all. So sounds like there'd probably be some good cross country skiing there as well.
Yeah, there's the like I said, the rails trail. It's an old CPR line, train line that runs right along the river, close to here, and that's the line. The train line's out, so it's now just a path, and they groom it for cross country skiing. And I haven't done that myself yet. It's on my to-do list, but it's a lovely walk.
Yeah, we have a few rail trails out here, and they're amazing to ride on and stuff. I haven't tried them for skiing yet, but for riding in the summertime, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
So I like to share both successes and failures, so there's a chance that someone listening might not make the same mistake. Can you tell us a time where you screwed up or made the wrong startup or pivot?
Oh, yeah, it kind of before Big Calm. So when I was leading a startup before, that one, well, that was one of those cases that nobody gets into startup life to do. It just kind of blew up that we had kind of absent shareholders that decided to block an acquisition, so kind of block the exit, and you don't really get into startup life to get cut off like that. And so I 2 big lessons that came from that painful experience. 3, I'd say. One is the value of community for startup founders is super important. So that when you are dealing with founder drama, it's a very lonely space, and you can't always talk to investors or potential investors, or you need to know who your trusted network is there to just talk through those challenges, because it can be difficult. So, networking with other founder leaders is really important. I think for me, I made the mistake of personally supporting the payroll while we were trying to bridge over into that acquisition, and that was expensive and didn't work, and ultimately they're still upset when you have to let them go. So as much as I love the team, that's something I wouldn't advise any other founder to do if you're in that situation. And then thirdly is that even from a very early stage, look at the cap table and regularly check in to make sure that the effort, whether it's money or time or connections, that the effort by all players is on that cap table matches kind of their proportion of the cap table, and to not tolerate um, things that are out of proportion on that, because that'll eventually catch up.
What's your favorite book for entrepreneurs?
Oh, I think reading widely outside of the kind of the entrepreneurial chamber is really important. I have, yeah, I'd say I have three kind of at different stages.
Perfect.
The first one is one that's out of print and is maybe not that well known, but it's and it's a bit outdated too, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book around building product. And that's called The Five Myths of Consumer Behavior. And just it perfectly lays out how you should build a product, at the early stage, and then how it can scale. On the scaling side, I'd suggest Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. That's a book I've always gone back to because the lessons there have been somewhat timeless in terms of getting that product over into a full size market. What are the pitfalls there? Then the need for focus. And then thirdly, Traction by Gino Wickman, I think, is a good playbook for operating a company, especially as you move into a scaling or a scale up side of things, is that it's got a good introduction of process and some good transparency tools in terms of discussions and navigating challenges and improvements. So those would be my three, I think, for startup recommendations.
Good recommendations. Now, what communities or resources, speaking of communities, do you recommend for people starting up, and why?
I loved falling into the improv community. That's probably not an answer you were
Perfect.
expecting, but when I was in Montreal, I started going to shows, and then I'd go to their weekend workshops, and then eventually did five levels of kind of improv training, which was a big stretch, a big kind of bold move for me personally, and it really helped with my public presentation skills. It really helped with, I mean, the principles of improv and ensemble, working together as a team, navigating emergence collectively, knowing when to kind of wipe a scene and start over, and knowing how to build on other people's ideas, play to everyone's strengths, I think. And also to learn by doing, and to have an action bias, and kind of all of the lessons that permeate over into entrepreneurship. I think improv is just a wonderful toolkit to wear. It's very useful in all aspects of life. So I'd highly recommend, and it's a wonderful community. It's just a very supportive community. And at advanced levels, maybe it can get a little competitive, but at amateur levels, it's such a great support group, and a fun release and great team building. Those are great resources and community to find. That's again outside of the startup circles and the schmooze fests.
No, that's great. Actually, I've taken a couple of drop-in improv sessions that have been great. And every couple of years we host actually startup improv, where I'll bring an improv
Oh,
person in, just for founders to come in, and we'll do some exercise and stuff, because I believe exactly what you said. It's amazing
yeah,
to get people out of their shells, and so many things. Like, we're a pitch coach among other things. And one of the things you got to teach people is you're going to screw up, and you're going to be embarrassed, and the slide's not going to work, and you just got to keep going. Same thing with improv, right? If you think about what you said and whatever, no, you got to keep going. And You know, it doesn't matter that you made a mistake. No one cares. And you've got to kind of learn that. And improv's perfect for, among other things, just getting over your mistakes and getting over yourself.
And understanding that, I mean, what is the role of an entrepreneur? It's making something from uncertainty, and
Absolutely.
building a scene with others in an uncertain um, world. That's exactly it.
And the one exercise I really love in this, and it's probably a little inside baseball, is building the machine. Is perfect for the uh, improv exercise where you got to get the group together, don't even know each other, and they all play a part in the machine, and the last person has to describe what it does, and it's crazy. And that kind of improv exercise really builds a team together, and it's just amazing. And I think you're absolutely right. It's not directly related, and it's not necessarily what I expected, but it's fantastic advice.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of fantastic advice, do you have any tips for founders?
Uh, I think, well, I'm looking out the window here at like kind of the path in the woods here is get out a little bit. I mean, founders are often told to get out of the building and talk to customers. That's really important. I think it's important to get out and just like a walk and talk it can be very productive. Like as much as I love whiteboards, find other spaces to perhaps build out different ideas, or do it as you're moving, as the blood is flowing.
So what's next for you and Big Calm?
Well, we're really focused on this raise right now with Equivesto, because that will help us determine if we're building in phases or building all at once this year. And then the groundworks of that kind of next stage of our build out is what's next on the horizon. So we've pretty much wrapped up the work on the building, so that central community space, the Shangri-Loft, and then it's working on the groundworks, the earthworks for the pads themselves. So we've got our first long-term renter rolling in about 5 weeks. So that's exciting for us.
Very exciting. 5 weeks. It's happening. That's a blink of an eye.
Yes.
Literally. So one more time, where can people go and find out more about you and Big Calm and your raise?
Big Calm is online at bigcalm.ca, and we're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. All of those links are also at bigcalm.ca. If you're interested in coming out to visit, to stay in the pocket getaway, as we call it here, that's at bigcalm.ca/visit. If you're interested in investing, that's at bigcalm.ca/invest, or on the Equivesto offerings side of things.
I really appreciate you taking the time today. It's been great learning all about tiny homes and permaculture. Steve, it's been great learning about Big Calm and Tiny Homesteads. I really appreciate it.
Really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, thanks for connecting. I know we're out of Toronto, but there is a lot of interest from folks in Ontario, and whether it's visiting or living or investing. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation with you.
Yeah, and I want to talk to startups all across Canada. So if you're outside of Toronto and you're listening to this and you want to get on Startup Talk, send me a message. I'm happy to talk to you. Thanks again, Steve. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Greg. Take care.